What would you do if a stranger handed you a stock tip that could make you millions? For Zane, an airline worker struggling to make ends meet, this wasn't just a hypothetical question. It was a life-changing moment that led him down a path of wealth, secrecy, and moral conflict. Zane's days at the airport were a blur of suitcases and stressed travelers. He checked his worn wallet, counting the meager bills inside. Another month of barely scraping by loomed ahead. As he scanned boarding passes, a commotion at the security checkpoint caught his attention. A well-dressed woman frantically emptied her designer handbag, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "My passport," she muttered, her voice tinged with panic. "I can't miss this flight." Zane couldn't help but notice her expensive watch and tailored suit, a stark contrast to his own rumpled uniform. As their eyes met across the crowded terminal, Zane wondered, what could possibly connect two people from such different worlds? Little did he know, their chance encounter would soon turn both their lives upside down. Alicia's heart raced as she frantically searched her designer handbag. Her passport was nowhere to be found. She glanced at her watch, panic rising in her throat. This wasn't just any flight she was about to miss. It was her lifeline, her escape from a web of lies that was quickly unraveling. Zane watched the well-dressed woman's distress from his post. He'd seen countless frazzled travelers, but something about her desperation struck a chord. Maybe it was the stark contrast between her polished appearance and her obvious turmoil. Or perhaps it was the glimmer of an opportunity. People in crisis often tipped generously, and Zane could certainly use the extra cash. "Can I help you with anything, ma'am?" Zane approached cautiously, his voice calm and professional. Alicia's head snapped up. Her eyes willed with fear for a moment before she collected herself. "My passport," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't find it, and I absolutely cannot miss this connecting flight." Zane nodded sympathetically. "Let's retrace your steps. When did you last see it?" As they worked through the problem, Zane couldn't help but wonder what could make someone so composed seem so desperate. He'd dealt with entitled passengers before, but this woman's urgency felt different. It wasn't just impatience or inconvenience. There was real fear behind her eyes. Alicia's mind raced as she followed Zane through the airport and back onto the plane. She wouldn't have been able to get back through without his help. Every security camera felt like an accusing eye, every passerby a potential federal agent. She knew it was paranoid, but with millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains weighing on her conscience, paranoia felt justified. Zane's efficiency impressed her. He seemed to know every shortcut and workaround in the airport's labyrinthine bureaucracy. As they approached the plane, a small part of her wondered if she should just come clean, turn herself in. But the thought of prison, of losing everything she'd worked for, even if some of it was gained through less than legal means, was too much to bear. "Here it is!" Zane's triumphant voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He held up her passport, looking far too pleased with himself for such a simple act. Relief washed over Alicia, quickly followed by guilt. This kind stranger had no idea he was helping a criminal flee the country. She glanced at her watch again. She still had a chance to make her flight. "Thank you," she breathed, reaching for her wallet. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Zane's eyes flickered to her expensive purse, then back to her face. He'd been right. This would be a good tip. But as he watched her trembling hands, he felt a twinge of concern. "Are you sure you're all right, ma'am? I mean, that was a tough search. I don't know what you would have done without me," said Zane, clearly looking for a tip. Alicia paused, struck by his genuine concern. In that moment, she made a split-second decision that would change both their lives forever. "Actually," she said, leaning in close, "there is one more thing. A piece of advice to show my gratitude." She scribbled something on a slip of paper and pressed it into his hand. "It's a stock tip. Trust me, it's worth more than any cash I could give you." Before Zane could react, Alicia was gone, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. He stood there, Stunned, the paper clutched in his fist. Part of him wanted to chase after her, to demand an explanation. But a larger part, the part that was tired of living paycheck to paycheck, unfurled the note and read the hastily scrawled stock symbol. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can lead down an unexpected path. As Zane stepped forward to help the frantic woman, he had no idea he was about to become entangled in a web of high-stakes crime and moral compromise. What would push a successful lawyer to such extreme measures? As Zane tucked the paper into his pocket, a seed of hope took root. Maybe this was his chance, his ticket out of financial struggle. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Why would a complete stranger give him such valuable information? What was she running from? Zane's fingers trembled as he unfolded the slip of paper, revealing a cryptic series of letters and numbers. Could this mysterious code be the key to unlocking a fortune? Or was it a trap that would ensnare him in something far more sinister than he could imagine? He stared at the hastily scrawled stock symbol, his mind racing with possibilities. The woman's words echoed in his ears. Trust me, it's worth more than any cash I could give you. Zane had seen his fair share of desperate passengers, but something about her urgency felt different. It wasn't just impatience or inconvenience. There was real fear behind her eyes. As he tucked the paper into his pocket, a seed of hope took root. Maybe this was his chance, his ticket out of financial struggle. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Why would a complete stranger give him such valuable information? What was she running from? Zane glanced around the bustling airport, half expecting to see the mysterious woman again. But she had vanished into the sea of travelers, leaving him with nothing but a scrap of paper and a head full of questions. Throughout his shift, Zane found himself reaching into his pocket, running his fingers over the edges of the folded note. Each time, a mix of excitement and apprehension washed over him. He'd always been cautious with money. He had to be, living paycheck to paycheck. The idea of investing in stocks seemed like a game for the wealthy, not for someone like him who could barely afford his rent. As he scanned boarding passes and directed confused passengers, Zane's mind kept drifting back to the woman. Her designer clothes, her expensive watch. She clearly knew something about money. But there was something else too. A desperation that didn't fit with her polished appearance. When his shift finally ended, Zane found a quiet corner of the airport and pulled out his phone. With shaking hands, he typed the stock symbol into a search engine. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the results. The company was real, and from what he could gather, it was on the verge of a major breakthrough in clean energy technology. Zane's heart raced. This could be it, the opportunity he'd been waiting for. But doubt crept in again. What if it was too good to be true? What if he lost what little savings he had? He thought about his tiny apartment, the stack of bills on his kitchen table, the dreams he'd put on hold because he could never seem to get ahead. Then he thought about the woman's eyes, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Was it guilt? Zane stood up, his decision made. He would research more, maybe even ask his friend who worked at a bank for advice. But deep down, he knew he was going to take the risk. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. As he walked out of the airport, the weight of the paper in his pocket felt like it could change everything. Zane took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness, helping a stranger find her passport, would lead him down a path of wealth, secrecy, and moral conflict. The city lights flickered around him as he made his way home, each step taking him further from the life he knew and closer to an uncertain future. Zane couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than himself. But whether it would lift him up or pull him under, only time would tell. The city never slept, and neither did Zane that night. As he tossed and turned, one thought kept him awake. Could a stranger's secret be the key to unlocking his dreams? Or would it become the lock on a prison cell? Zane sat at his small kitchen table, the slip of paper with the stock tip laid out before him. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light, open to a financial news website. He'd been researching for hours, trying to make sense of the company behind the mysterious stock symbol. Clean energy technology, he muttered, scrolling through articles. The more he read, the more legitimate it seemed. But doubt still gnawed at him. Why would a stranger give him such valuable information? What if it was all a scam? He picked up his phone, hesitating before dialing a number. "Hey, Mike," he said when his friend answered. "You still work at that investment firm, right? I need some advice." Mike's voice was groggy with sleep. "Zane? It's 2 a.m. What's going on?" Zane explained the situation, careful to leave out the details about the mysterious woman at the airport. He held his breath as Mike considered the information. "Look, man," Mike finally said, "it sounds promising, but investing always carries risk, especially if you're talking about putting in a significant amount of your savings." Zane's shoulders slumped. He knew Mike was right, but a part of him had hoped for a more enthusiastic response. "Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the honesty." After hanging up, Zane stared at his bank account balance. The numbers seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of his financial struggles. He thought about his dreams, owning a home, starting a business, helping his family. All of them felt so far out of reach. But what if they weren't? What if this was his chance? Zane closed his eyes, remembering the woman's face at the airport. The desperation in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. She had seemed so sure that this tip was valuable. More valuable than cash. His finger hovered over the transfer funds button on his banking app. This was it. The moment of truth. A leap of faith that could change everything. With a deep breath, Zane pressed the button. He watched as his savings drained from his account, transferred to a newly created investment account. The stock purchase went through moments later. As the confirmation appeared on his screen, Zane felt a mix of excitement and terror. He had just bet everything on a stranger's word. Was he a fool or a visionary? The next few days were a blur of anxiety and constant stock checking. Zane's coworkers noticed his distraction, the dark circles under his eyes. "You okay, man?" his supervisor asked. "You seem off." Zane forced a smile. "Just didn't sleep well," he lied. How could he explain that his entire future hung in the balance of a stock chart? On the third day, as Zane scrolled through his phone during his lunch break, he nearly choked on his sandwich. The stock had jumped. Not just a little, but significantly. His initial investment had already doubled. He blinked, sure he was seeing things. But the numbers didn't lie. Zane's heart raced as he did the math. He had more money now than he'd ever had in his life. As the days passed, the stock continued to climb. Zane watched in disbelief as his net worth grew exponentially. He began to dream bigger, to imagine a life free from financial worry. But with the growing wealth came growing unease. Zane couldn't shake the feeling that this was too good to be true. He remembered the fear in the woman's eyes at the airport. What was she running from? And by accepting her tip, had he inadvertently tied himself to whatever trouble she was in? Zane's eyes were glued to his phone screen, the stock ticker a constant companion. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, his initial investment grew beyond his wildest dreams. The numbers seemed to dance, each uptick sending a jolt of excitement through his body. At first, Zane couldn't believe it. He'd check and recheck his account, sure there must be some mistake. But the truth was undeniable. His gamble on a stranger's tip was paying off in ways he never imagined possible. He suddenly felt an urge to scream in his home. "Woo, I'm rich! I'm rich! You guys are poor, but I'm rich! Ooh, I'm about to run up this check." As his wealth grew, so did the possibilities. Zane found himself daydreaming at work, imagining a life free from financial worries. He started small at first, paying off his credit card debt and putting away money for emergencies. But as the stock continued its meteoric rise, his plans became bolder. One day, while on his lunch break, Zane made a decision that would change everything. He marched into his supervisor's office and handed in his resignation. The look of shock on his boss's face was almost comical. "Are you sure about this, Zane?" his supervisor asked, concern evident in his voice. "The job market isn't exactly booming right now." Zane just smiled, a newfound confidence radiating from him. "I'm sure," he replied. "It's time for me to pursue other opportunities." With his newfound freedom, Zane's life began to transform. He moved out of his cramped apartment into a spacious condo with a view of the city. His wardrobe, once filled with worn uniforms and budget basics, now boasted designer labels. He even splurged on a sleek sports car, the kind he used to only admire from afar in the airport parking lot. But it wasn't all about material possessions. Zane found himself able to help his family in ways he never could before. He paid off his parents' mortgage, surprising them with the news over a fancy dinner. The tears in his mother's eyes made every penny worth it. As word of his sudden success spread, Zane's social circle began to shift. Old friends looked at him differently, a mix of awe and suspicion in their eyes. New acquaintances appeared, drawn to his newfound status and wealth. Zane found himself navigating a world he'd only ever observed from the sidelines. One evening, as Zane sat on his balcony overlooking the city, he couldn't help but marvel at how quickly his life had changed. Just weeks ago, he was counting pennies and worrying about making rent. Now, he was contemplating which exotic location to visit for his next vacation. But even as he basked in his success, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of his mind. The memory of the mysterious woman at the airport, her desperation and fear, still lingered. What was she running from? And by accepting her tip, had Zane inadvertently tied himself to something dangerous? He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on his plans for the future. With his newfound wealth, Zane decided to explore the world of real estate investment. He began researching properties, attending seminars, and networking with other investors. It was a whole new world, filled with possibilities and potential. As Zane dove deeper into his new ventures, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had become surreal. The contrast between his past and present was stark, almost dizzying. He found himself wondering if this was all too good to be true. Zane stepped out of his sleek sports car, adjusting his designer sunglasses, as he took in the view of his new oceanfront property. The salty breeze ruffled his tailored suit, a far cry from the worn airline uniform he'd donned just months ago. His life had transformed at a dizzying pace, each day bringing new luxuries and opportunities he'd once only dreamed of. The real estate agent greeted him with a wide smile, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Thompson, I think you'll be very pleased with this investment opportunity. Shall we take a look inside?" Zane nodded, following her into the sprawling beachfront mansion. As they toured the property, his mind wandered to the whirlwind of changes that had brought him here. The stock tip from the mysterious woman at the airport had paid off beyond his wildest expectations, catapulting him into a world of wealth he'd never imagined possible. His first major purchase had been a penthouse condo in the heart of the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the skyline. He'd filled it with modern artwork and sleek furniture, relishing the feeling of finally having a space that reflected his newfound status. Travel became a regular part of Zane's life. He jetted off to exotic locations on a whim, staying in five-star resorts and indulging in experiences he'd only seen in movies. From sipping champagne on a private yacht in the Mediterranean to heli-skiing in the Swiss Alps, each adventure felt like a dream come true. As Zane's lifestyle changed, so did his relationships. Old friends from his airline days seemed uncomfortable around him now, their conversations strained by the obvious disparity in their circumstances. Some accused him of forgetting where he came from, while others hinted at loans or investment opportunities they hoped he'd consider. Family dynamics shifted too. Zane's parents, though grateful for his generosity in paying off their mortgage, struggled to understand his new world. His mother fretted over his extravagant spending, while his father questioned the wisdom of leaving a stable job for the unpredictable world of investments. At the same time, Zane found himself surrounded by a new crowd of wealthy acquaintances. They invited him to exclusive clubs and high-stakes poker games, introducing him to a lifestyle of excess he'd never known existed. It was intoxicating, but a small part of him wondered if these new friends truly cared about him, or just his bank account. As the real estate agent droned on about property values and potential rental income, Zane's thoughts turned to his latest venture. He'd been studying the real estate market intensely, recognizing it as a way to solidify and grow his newfound wealth. This beachfront property was just the beginning. He had plans for a portfolio of luxury rentals and commercial developments. Yet even as he reveled in his success, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of Zane's mind. The memory of the desperate woman at the airport, her eyes wild with fear as she pressed the stock tip into his hand, still haunted him. What had she been running from? And by accepting her advice, had he unknowingly entangled himself in something dangerous? Zane pushed the thought aside as the real estate agent led him onto the property's private beach. He took a deep breath, letting the sound of crashing waves wash over him. This was his life now. Wealth, luxury, endless possibilities. He'd worked hard and taken a chance, and it had paid off. He deserved this, didn't he? As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ocean, Zane made his decision. "I'll take it," he told the agent, his voice confident and assured. She beamed, already calculating her commission. Zane stayed on the beach long after the agent left, watching the sky turn from gold to deep purple. He thought about how far he'd come, from struggling airline worker to millionaire investor. It felt like a fairy tale come true. Zane's moment of contentment on the beach was short-lived. Little did he know, a storm was brewing that would threaten everything he had gained. How long could he outrun the consequences of his good fortune? The next morning, Zane woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing with notifications. He reached for it, expecting to see more congratulatory messages about his latest real estate acquisition. Instead, he found a flurry of news alerts about an ongoing investigation into insider trading. At first, Zane barely skimmed the headlines. This kind of financial scandal seemed worlds away from his own success story. He had earned his wealth through a lucky break and smart investments, not through any underhanded dealings. Or so he thought. As he scrolled through his news feed, a familiar name caught his eye. Alicia Donovan, the woman who had given him the life-changing stock tip at the airport, was mentioned in passing. Zane's heart skipped a beat. He tapped on the article, his finger trembling slightly. The report detailed an extensive investigation into a major law firm suspected of using insider information to manipulate the stock market. Alicia's name appeared in a list of lawyers under scrutiny. Zane's mind raced back to that fateful day at the airport. Alicia's desperation, her insistence on catching that flight, the cryptic stock tip she had pressed into his hand. Zane tried to push away the growing unease in his gut. He told himself it was just a coincidence. Plenty of lawyers shared the same name, right? But as he dug deeper into the story, more details emerged that seemed to line up with his encounter with Alicia. The investigation focused on a clean energy technology company, the very same one Zane had invested in. The stock's meteoric rise, which had seemed like a miracle to Zane, was now being called into question. Phrases like artificially inflated value and fraudulent trading practices jumped out at him from the screen. Zane's palms began to sweat as he realized the implications. If Alicia had given him insider information, his windfall wasn't just luck, it was potentially illegal. The thought made him feel sick. He had built a whole new life on this foundation. What would happen if it all came crashing down? He spent the rest of the day glued to his phone and laptop, obsessively following every update on the investigation. Each new piece of information felt like another nail in the coffin of his dreams. The carefree joy he had felt just yesterday on the beach seemed like a distant memory. As evening fell, Zane found himself pacing in his luxurious penthouse, the city lights twinkling below. He tried to rationalize his actions. He hadn't known the tip was insider information. He was just an innocent bystander who got lucky. But deep down, he knew that ignorance wouldn't be a defense if the authorities came knocking. The weight of his newfound wealth suddenly felt suffocating. The designer clothes in his closet, the keys to his sports car, the deeds to his properties, all of it now seemed tainted. Zane wondered if he should come forward, explain his side of the story before things got worse. But the thought of losing everything he had gained was terrifying. As night fell, Zane found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the investigation led back to him? What if they discovered his connection to Alicia? Would anyone believe that he was just an unwitting beneficiary of her tip? As dawn broke, Zane's restless night gave way to a gnawing suspicion. How deep did this rabbit hole go? And could he pull himself out before it was too late? Zane slouched at his desk, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep. His laptop screen glowed with tabs full of news articles and financial reports. He'd spent hours researching Alicia Donovan and her law firm, each new piece of information adding to the knot in his stomach. The prestigious law firm where Alicia worked was now at the center of a major insider trading investigation. Zane's fingers trembled as he scrolled through article after article detailing the allegations. Words like securities fraud and illegal stock manipulation jumped out at him, each one feeling like a personal accusation. He pulled up the stock chart for the clean energy company he'd invested in. The meteoric rise that had seemed like a miracle now looked suspicious. Zane thought back to the day at the airport, replaying Alicia's words in his mind. "Trust me, it's worth more than any cash I could give you." Had she known what was coming? Zane rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of it all. He'd always prided himself on being an honest person, but now he found himself wondering if he'd unknowingly become part of something illegal. The thought made him feel sick. He opened a new tab and started researching the legal consequences of insider trading. The potential penalties were severe: hefty fines, years in prison, and a permanent mark on your record. Zane's mind raced. Would anyone believe he was just an innocent bystander who got lucky? As the morning wore on, Zane found himself trying to rationalize his actions. He hadn't known the tip was insider information. He was just a guy who took a chance and got lucky. But deep down, he knew that ignorance wouldn't be a defense if the authorities came knocking. He glanced around his luxurious penthouse, taking in the designer furniture and expensive art. The view of the city skyline that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock him. Everything he'd gained in the past few months suddenly felt tainted. Zane's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a reminder about a meeting with his real estate agent to discuss his next investment property. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. Should he cancel? Put everything on hold until he figured this out? But the thought of giving up his new lifestyle was almost physically painful. He'd worked so hard for so long, always struggling to make ends meet. Now that he finally had everything he'd ever wanted, how could he just let it go? Zane made a decision. He would go to the meeting, act like everything was normal. Maybe if he just kept moving forward, kept building his empire, he could outrun the shadows of his past. He pushed away the nagging voice in his head that whispered, "This was a mistake." As he showered and dressed in one of his new designer suits, Zane tried to convince himself that everything would be fine. He was just being paranoid. Lots of people got lucky in the stock market. There was no way to prove he'd done anything wrong. But as he headed out the door, Zane couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on thin ice. How long could he keep up this charade? And what would happen when the truth finally caught up with him? Zane's carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. Little did he know, the next few hours would force him to confront the consequences of his choices. How far would he go to protect his ill-gotten gains? The evening news flickered on Zane's giant flat-screen TV as he settled into his designer sofa, nursing a glass of expensive whiskey. He was about to mute the broadcast when a familiar name caught his attention. "Breaking news in the world of high finance," the anchor announced. Alicia Donovan, a prominent lawyer at the prestigious firm of Goldstein and Associates, has been implicated in a major insider trading scandal. Zane's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the imported marble floor. His heart raced as he leaned forward, hanging on every word. The anchor continued. Federal investigators allege that Donovan used privileged information to manipulate stock prices, particularly in the clean energy sector. The scale of the fraud is estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Images flashed across the screen. Alicia being led away in handcuffs, FBI agents raiding law offices, charts showing suspicious stock activity. Zane recognized the familiar spike in the graph. It was the same pattern that had made him rich. His mind reeled back to that fateful day at the airport. Alicia's desperation, her insistence on catching that flight, the cryptic stock tip she had pressed into his hand. It all made sense now. She wasn't just running late for a meeting. She was fleeing the country. Zane's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor, heedless of the broken glass. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just an innocent bystander who got lucky. He was an unwitting participant in a massive financial crime. The news droned on, detailing the potential consequences for those involved. Hefty fines, prison sentences, permanent bans from the financial industry. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of Zane's dreams. He stumbled to his home office, frantically pulling up his investment records. The stock that had changed his life now seemed toxic, poisoning everything it touched. Zane's finger hovered over the sell button, but he hesitated. Selling now might raise suspicions, but keeping the stock felt like holding onto a ticking time bomb. His phone buzzed incessantly, friends and business associates wanting to know if he'd seen the news, if he was okay. Zane ignored them all. How could he explain? Who would believe that he was just an innocent bystander? As the night wore on, Zane paced his penthouse, his mind racing through scenarios. Should he come forward? Try to explain his side of the story? Or should he keep quiet and hope the investigation never led back to him? The weight of his newfound wealth, once a source of joy, now felt like shackles. He thought about his family, how proud they had been of his sudden success. His mother's tears of joy when he paid off their mortgage. The respect in his father's eyes when he talked about his real estate ventures. Would they understand if they knew the truth? Or would they be ashamed? Zane's gaze fell on a framed photo from his airline days. He barely recognized the man in the worn uniform, smiling despite the financial struggles. That man had integrity, principles. When had Zane lost sight of that? As dawn broke, Zane made a decision. He couldn't live with this secret, couldn't build a life on a foundation of lies. With shaking hands, he picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer's number. It was time to come clean, whatever the consequences. The phone rang, each trill feeling like an eternity. Zane took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation that would change everything. As his lawyer's groggy voice answered, Zane felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The morning sun barely peeked through the blinds when Zane's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. His heart raced as he answered, half expecting to hear a federal agent's voice. Instead, it was his supervisor at the airline, asking him to come in for an informal chat. Zane's palms grew sweaty as he agreed, his mind spinning with possibilities. As Zane drove to the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that lingered too long behind him, every pedestrian who glanced his way, seemed suspicious. He parked in his old spot, the familiar surroundings now feeling alien and hostile. Inside the terminal, Zane noticed two men in suits watching the security checkpoint. Their sharp eyes scanned the crowd, and Zane's breath caught when one of them looked his way. He ducked his head, hurrying towards the staff area. His supervisor, Mike, greeted him with a strained smile. "Thanks for coming in, Zane. We just have a few questions about your time here."
The interview started innocently enough, with queries about his daily routines and interactions with passengers. But as it progressed, Zane felt the net tightening around him.
"Do you remember anything unusual about your last few shifts?" Mike asked, his tone carefully neutral. Zane's mind flashed to Alicia, her desperate eyes and the slip of paper she'd pressed into his hand. He swallowed hard, forcing a casual shrug. "Nothing comes to mind. Why do you ask?" Mike leaned forward, his voice lowering. "We've had some inquiries from federal investigators. They're looking into a passenger who may have passed through our terminal. A lawyer named Alicia Donovan. Ring any bells?"
Zane's heart hammered in his chest. He fought to keep his expression neutral, years of customer service training coming to his rescue. "The name doesn't sound familiar. We see so many passengers, you know?"
Mike nodded, but his eyes remained sharp. "Of course. But if you remember anything, even the smallest detail, let me know. The feds are taking this very seriously." As Zane left the office, he felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He'd managed to avoid revealing his connection to Alicia, but for how long? The walls seemed to be closing in. Over the next few days, Zane noticed subtle changes in his daily life. His emails took longer to load, as if they were being screened. His phone calls sometimes had strange echoes or clicks. Even his neighbors seemed to be watching him more closely. Paranoia crept in, coloring every interaction. When a colleague invited him to happy hour, Zane wondered if it was a ploy to get him to talk. When a real estate agent called about a potential investment, he feared it might be an investigator in disguise. The final straw came during a routine visit to his bank. As Zane discussed his accounts with the teller, he noticed a man in a dark suit watching him intently. The man's hand rested near an earpiece, and his stance screamed, "Law enforcement!" Panic rose in Zane's throat. He cut the conversation short and hurried out, nearly forgetting his bank card in his haste. As he rushed to his car, he heard footsteps behind him. Zane's pace quickened, his keys jangling in his trembling hands.
"Excuse me, sir!"
a voice called out. Zane froze, his heart pounding. This was it. They'd caught up to him. His mind raced through his options. Should he run? Try to explain? Demand a lawyer? Slowly, he turned around, bracing himself for handcuffs. Instead, he saw the bank teller, holding out his forgotten card.
"You left this at the counter,"
she said with a smile. Zane let out a shaky breath, taking the card with a murmured thanks. As he drove home, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving him exhausted and scared. That night, Zane lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The close call at the bank replayed in his mind. How much longer could he keep this up? The stress was eating away at him, turning his dream life into a nightmare. He thought about Alicia, wondering where she was now. Had she managed to escape, or was she already in custody? And if she was caught, how long before she mentioned the helpful airport worker she'd given a stock tip to? Zane's conscience gnawed at him, each passing day making his dilemma more acute. He'd always considered himself an honest man, but now he faced a test that would define his character. What price would he pay for his silence? And could he afford the cost to his soul? The weight of his secret pressed down on him, making even the simplest tasks feel like a burden. As he poured his morning coffee, Zane's hand trembled, spilling drops on the pristine countertop of his luxury kitchen. He stared at the dark stains, a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Zane needed to talk to someone, to unburden himself before the pressure crushed him. But who could he trust? His new wealthy acquaintances were more interested in his bank account than his moral dilemma. His old friends from the airline felt like strangers now, separated by a chasm of wealth and lifestyle. After much deliberation, Zane decided to reach out to Mike, his former supervisor at the airport. They'd always had a good rapport, and Mike had a reputation for being level-headed and discreet. Zane sent a text, asking to meet for coffee. They met at a small cafe, far from the glitzy establishments Zane now frequented. As Mike slid into the booth, Zane felt a pang of nostalgia for his simpler life. "So, what's on your mind?" Mike asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You seemed pretty rattled when we talked at the airport." Zane took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm in a complicated situation. I came into some money recently, and I'm not sure if I got it the right way." Mike's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a statement. What do you mean by not the right way?" Zane's heart raced as he tried to explain without revealing too much. "Let's say I got a tip from someone. A really good tip that paid off big time. But now I'm wondering if that person had information they shouldn't have had."
Mike leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Are we talking insider trading here, Zane?"
The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Zane's silence was answer enough. Mike sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, Zane, I'm not a lawyer or a financial advisor, but I've been around long enough to know that these things rarely end well. If you're asking my opinion, I'd say keep your mouth shut and enjoy what you've got."
Zane blinked, surprised by Mike's advice. "You don't think I should come clean?"
"And risk losing everything? For what?" Mike shook his head. "You didn't ask for that tip. You didn't know where it came from. As far as anyone's concerned, you just got lucky. Why throw that away?" Zane nodded slowly, mulling over Mike's words. Part of him felt relieved at the idea of staying quiet, of preserving his newfound wealth and status. But another part, a voice he'd been trying to ignore, whispered that this wasn't the man he wanted to be. As they parted ways, Mike clapped Zane on the shoulder. "Just think about it, okay? Don't do anything rash." Zane walked home, his mind a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. The city bustled around him, people rushing to and fro, caught up in their own lives and struggles. He wondered how many of them carried secrets like his, how many faced similar moral crossroads. Back in his penthouse, Zane stood at the window, looking out over the city he now called home. The view that had once filled him with pride now seemed tainted, a constant reminder of the choice he faced. He thought about his parents, how proud they were of his success. Would they still be proud if they knew the truth? He imagined their faces if he confessed, the disappointment and confusion that would replace their beaming smiles. Then he thought about Alicia, the woman who had set this all in motion. Where was she now? Had she escaped? Or was she facing the consequences of her actions? And if she was caught, how long before the trail led back to him? The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city. Zane's reflection stared back at him from the window, a stranger in expensive clothes with worry lines etched into his face. He barely recognized himself anymore. As night fell, Zane found himself at his desk, staring at his phone. The number for his lawyer was pulled up on the screen, his finger hovering over the call button. One press, and he could set the wheels in motion, come clean about everything. But Mike's words echoed in his mind. Why throw it all away? Why indeed? Hadn't he worked hard all his life, always struggling to get ahead? Didn't he deserve this break, even if it came from a questionable source? Zane's newfound riches opened doors he never imagined, but they also cast long shadows. As he navigated his transformed life, he discovered an unexpected truth. Sometimes, having everything you want leaves you wanting something money can't buy. The penthouse felt cavernous and cold as Zane paced its polished floors. He paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the glittering cityscape. It was a view he'd dreamed of for years, but now it felt hollow, a constant reminder of the secret weighing on his conscience. He turned away from the window, his eyes falling on the sleek leather sofa where a stack of financial papers lay scattered. Zane had spent hours poring over investment opportunities, but each decision felt tainted. Was he making choices based on sound judgment, or was he desperately trying to justify his ill-gotten gains? Zane's phone buzzed with a notification. Another charity was reaching out, hoping for a donation from the city's newest millionaire. He hesitated, then opened his banking app. With a few taps, he transferred a substantial sum to the organization's account. It was becoming a habit. Anonymous donations to worthy causes. Part of him hoped these acts of generosity might balance the scales of karma. But as he set the phone down, the familiar emptiness crept back in. The donations should have made him feel good, should have given him a sense of purpose. Instead, they felt like desperate attempts to assuage his guilt. Zane wandered into his home office, running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound books he'd never read. He'd filled the shelves with impressive titles, trying to cultivate the image of a sophisticated businessman. Now, they felt like props in an elaborate charade. He sank into his ergonomic chair, swiveling to face the wall of accolades and certificates he'd earned since his windfall. Business Leader of the Year, Philanthropist Awards, honorary degrees, each one a testament to his outward success. But as he stared at his reflection in the glass frames, Zane saw a stranger looking back at him. The sound of laughter drifted up from the street below, drawing Zane back to the window. He watched a group of friends, arm in arm, stumbling out of a nearby bar. Their carefree joy was a stark contrast to the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in his stomach. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of genuine happiness? Zane tried to remember, but the memories of his life before the stock tips seemed to belong to someone else. He'd trade all the designer suits and luxury cars for one moment of that simple, unencumbered joy. A notification popped up on his smartwatch, a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting. Zane sighed, dreading another day of pretending to be the financial wizard everyone believed him to be. Each decision he made felt like a house of cards, ready to topple at the slightest breeze of scrutiny. He made his way to the kitchen, its state-of-the-art appliances gleaming in the low light. Opening the fridge, Zane stared at the array of gourmet ingredients and expensive wines. His stomach turned at the thought of eating alone again. What good was all this luxury if he had no one to share it with? Zane closed the fridge, opting instead for a glass of water. As he sipped, his eyes fell on a framed photo on the counter, a snapshot from his airline days, surrounded by smiling coworkers. The memory of that camaraderie, of feeling part of something larger than himself, hit him like a physical ache. He set the glass down, his reflection distorted in the polished surface of the counter. Who was he now? A successful businessman? A fraud living on borrowed time? Or something in between? A man trapped by his own choices, suffocating under the weight of wealth he never truly earned? Zane made his way to the bedroom, knowing sleep would be elusive. As he changed into silk pajamas, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. The designer sleepwear felt like a costume, a daily reminder of the role he was playing. Lying in bed, Zane stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He'd achieved everything he thought he wanted: financial security, status, the ability to help others. But the cost was higher than he'd ever imagined. His integrity, his peace of mind, his sense of self, all sacrificed on the altar of wealth. As Zane wrestled with his conscience, a knock at the door shattered his uneasy silence. Two stern-faced agents stood in the hallway, their badges glinting in the dim light. Zane's heart raced as he invited them in, his mind scrambling to maintain composure.
"Mr. Thompson?" the taller agent asked, his voice clipped and professional. "I'm Agent Benson, and this is Agent Carter. We're with the SEC. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your recent investments."
Zane nodded, gesturing towards the living room. As they settled into the plush leather chairs, he couldn't help but notice how out of place the agents looked in his luxurious surroundings. Their crisp suits and serious demeanor contrasted sharply with the carefully curated air of casual wealth he'd cultivated. "We're investigating some irregularities in the trading of green tech solutions," Agent Carter began, her eyes never leaving Zane's face. "Your name came up as someone who made significant investments just before their stock price surged. Can you tell us about that?" Zane's mouth went dry. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, but now that it was here, he felt woefully unprepared. I got lucky, I guess, he stammered, hating how unconvincing he sounded. I heard some buzz about clean energy and decided to take a chance. Agent Benson leaned forward, his gaze intense. And where exactly did you hear this buzz, Mr. Thompson? Any specific sources you can recall? Zane's mind raced. He thought of Alicia, her desperate eyes at the airport, the slip of paper pressed into his hand. He thought of Mike's advice to keep quiet, to protect what he'd gained. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Just around, Zane said, trying to keep his voice steady. You know how it is in financial circles. People talk. Agent Carter's eyebrow arched skeptically. Financial circles? Our records show that until recently, you were working as an airline employee. That's quite a career change. Zane felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. I've always had an interest in finance. I studied it in my spare time, made some smart choices. Sometimes things just work out, you know? The agents exchanged a look that made Zane's stomach churn. They clearly weren't buying his story. Agent Benson pulled out a tablet, swiping through what Zane assumed were financial records. Mr. Thompson, your investment patterns are unusual, to say the least. Large sums invested in specific companies just before major announcements or mergers. It's a pattern we've seen before in cases of insider trading. Zane's hands clenched involuntarily. He forced them to relax, acutely aware of every micro-expression that might give him away. I assure you, agents, I've done nothing wrong. I'm just a regular guy who got lucky in the market. Agent Carter leaned back, her eyes never leaving Zane's face. We've heard that before, Mr. Thompson, but luck doesn't usually follow such a consistent pattern. We'll need to see all your financial records, communications related to these investments, everything. Zane nodded, his mind racing. How much did they know? Had Alicia been caught? Had she mentioned him? He thought of his phone, his laptop, the trail of evidence that could unravel everything he'd built. Of course, he said, surprised at how calm his voice sounded. I'll have my assistant gather everything for you. Is there anything else I can help with? The agents stood, their expressions unreadable. We'll be in touch, Mr. Thompson, Agent Benson said. I suggest you don't make any travel plans in the near future. We may have more questions. As Zane showed them out, he felt as if he were watching himself from a distance. The careful facade he'd constructed was crumbling, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it together. Back in his living room, Zane sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He thought of his parents, of his old co-workers at the airline, of the life he'd left behind. For the first time since that fateful day at the airport, Zane allowed himself to consider the full consequences of his actions. Zane stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below. The view that once filled him with pride now felt like a gilded cage. He turned away, his gaze falling on the scattered papers on his desk, evidence of his meteoric rise and the lies that fueled it. What would you do if your moral compass suddenly pointed towards a fortune? For Zane, the line between right and wrong blurred as he grappled with a decision that could either preserve his millionaire status or clear his conscience. He sank into his leather chair, mind racing. The visit from the SEC agents had shaken him to his core. They knew something was off about his investments. It was only a matter of time before they connected the dots back to Alicia and that fateful day at the airport. Zane closed his eyes, imagining two possible futures stretching out before him. In one, he kept quiet. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, buried the evidence, and hoped the investigation would hit a dead end. He'd keep his wealth, his status, the admiration of his peers. But he'd always be looking over his shoulder, wondering when it would all come crashing down. In the other future, He came clean. He pictured himself walking into the SEC office, confessing everything. He saw the disappointment in his parents' eyes, the shocked faces of his new wealthy friends. His fortune would disappear, possibly replaced by a prison sentence. But he'd have his integrity intact. Zane's hand hovered over his phone. One call to his lawyer could set either future in motion. He thought about Mike's advice to keep quiet, to enjoy what he'd gained. It was tempting. So tempting. He'd worked hard all his life, always struggling to get ahead. Didn't he deserve this break, even if it came from a questionable source? But then he remembered the person he used to be. The man who took pride in an honest day's work, who believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. That man felt like a stranger now, buried under designer suits and moral compromises. Zane stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his office. He paused at the wall of awards and certificates, each one a testament to his outward success. But as he stared at his reflection in the glass frames, he saw a stranger looking back at him. A man living a lie, suffocating under the weight of ill-gotten gains. He thought about Alicia, wondering where she was now. Had she managed to escape, or was she already in custody? And if she was caught, how long before she mentioned the helpful airport worker she'd given a stock tip to? The silence of the penthouse pressed in on him, broken only by the ticking of an expensive clock on the wall. Each second that passed felt like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning. Zane realized he couldn't outrun the truth forever. Sooner or later, it would catch up to him. He sat back down at his desk, pulling out a legal pad. With a trembling hand, he began to write. Every detail of his encounter with Alicia, every investment he'd made based on her tip, every lie he'd told to cover his tracks. As the words flowed, Zane felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. When he finished, he read over what he'd written. It was all there in black and white, the story of how a single moment of weakness had spiraled into a web of deception. Zane took a deep breath, feeling both terrified and strangely calm. He picked up his phone, scrolling to his lawyer's number. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. This was it, the point of no return. One press, and he'd set in motion events that would strip away everything he'd gained. Zane thought about the life he'd built, the luxury he'd grown accustomed to. He thought about the good he'd done with his wealth, the charities he'd supported, the people he'd helped. Was he really willing to give all that up? But then he thought about the cost of keeping his secret. The constant fear, the gnawing guilt, the slow erosion of his self-respect. He realized that no amount of money was worth losing himself. With a deep breath, Zane pressed the call button. As the phone rang, he felt a strange mix of terror and relief wash over him. Whatever happened next, at least he'd be facing it as his true self. Zane's finger hovered over the end call button. Was he really ready to give it all up? As doubt crept in, he wondered, how far would he go to protect what he'd gained, and at what cost to his soul? The phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the polished floor. Zane's mind raced, his breath coming in short gasps. He'd been so close to confessing, to throwing away everything he'd built. But now, a new resolve hardened within him. This was his money, his life. No one would take it from him. Zane paced the room, his expensive shoes echoing in the vast space. He'd worked hard for this, hadn't he? Sure, the initial tip came from questionable sources, but everything after that was his doing. His smart investments, his calculated risks. Why should he have to give that up? He picked up the phone, dialing a different number. Jack, it's Zane. I need your help. We're going to fight this. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings and strategy sessions. Zane's decision to keep his wealth sent shockwaves through his personal and professional circles. His parents were torn, their pride in his success now tainted with concern and disappointment.
Zane, honey, his mother said during a tense family dinner. Are you sure this is the right thing to do? We raised you to be honest.
His father nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with a mix of worry and resignation. Son, sometimes the easy path isn't the right one. Zane pushed his food around his plate, unable to meet their gaze. I know what I'm doing, he muttered, more to convince himself than them. His friends' reactions were equally mixed. Some, like Mike from the airport, supported his decision wholeheartedly. You'd be crazy to give it all up, Mike said over drinks one night. Anyone in your position would do the same.
Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the moral implications of Zane's choice. He noticed the invitations to parties and events slowly dwindling, his phone growing quieter with each passing day.
As the legal process unfolded, Zane found himself in a precarious dance with the authorities. His lawyers advised a strategy of limited cooperation, providing just enough information to appear compliant without incriminating himself. Remember, Mr. Thompson, his lead attorney cautioned during a particularly tense meeting, every word you say can be used against you. We need to tread carefully. Zane nodded, his jaw clenched. He sat through hours of questioning, his responses carefully rehearsed. Yes, he'd made some fortunate investments. No, he wasn't privy to any inside information. It was all just luck and good timing. As the weeks turned into months, Zane's resolve began to waver. The constant stress of the investigation took its toll. He found himself jumping at every unexpected sound, scrutinizing every glance from strangers on the street. Was that man in the coffee shop an undercover agent? Did the woman at the gym recognize him from the news? His once lavish lifestyle began to feel like a prison. The penthouse that had been his pride and joy now felt like a gilded cage. The expensive clothes in his closet seemed to mock him, reminders of a carefree life that was slipping away. One night, as Zane sat alone in his living room, nursing a glass of scotch, he allowed himself to imagine a different path. What if he had come clean from the beginning? Would he be facing a simpler, if less luxurious life? Would he be able to sleep at night without the weight of his lies pressing down on him? He shook his head, banishing the thought. No, he'd made his choice. He would see this through, no matter the cost. As the investigation dragged on, Zane's lawyers assured him that things were looking up. The authorities seemed to be hitting dead ends, unable to definitively prove any wrongdoing. Zane began to breathe a little easier, allowing himself to believe that he might actually get away with it all.